I'm Veronica Marshall at the Capitol. This week on Senate Spotlight, during a tight budget year, one of the best ways to support economic development and growth across the state is by going back to the basics, like investing in people.
There's so much that we're doing this year to make sure that people are developing those skills and continuing to build on their skills.
We should have that pathway for education, and that should lead to a pathway for a career job.
The programs senators are supporting to help Minnesota businesses and entrepreneurs thrive. And social media companies profit from selling consumer data they get for free. Should they pay taxes on that?
Tax policy is about values. Minnesota can lead the way on values for this country.
The debate in the Senate around a nation-leading excise tax for social media platforms. That's all coming up.
Senate Spotlight is produced by the Minnesota Senate and Senate Media Services.
We now know who will fill the open Senate seat in northern Minnesota. With just over 60% of the vote, Republican Carrie Heintzman was voted in via a special election to represent Senate District 6. The district includes parts of Cass, Crow Wing, and Itasca counties. The senator-elect is expected to officially be sworn in next week. When it comes to the unemployment and labor market, Minnesota is above average. Though our unemployment rate rose to 3.1% in March, it's still lower than the national unemployment rate of 4.2%. And here in Minnesota, our labor force participation rate is at 68.2%, which is also better than the national rate of 62.5%. But that doesn't mean our work on that front is done. Joining me now is DFL Senator Susan Pha, who is tasked with improving the state's economic outlook through workforce development, unemployment compensation, and other strategies. Senator, thank you for being here.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Senator, through your work on the Jobs and Economic Development Committee, you hear from a variety of businesses and owners, and you've talked personally about how small businesses play a crucial role in their communities. Does their impact reach farther than that? How big of an impact do they have on us statewide?
Yeah, so in Minnesota, we have 525,000 small businesses that employs about 45 to 50% of our entire workforce, which is fantastic. You know, as a small business owner myself, someone who's been an entrepreneur my entire adult life, I know how important small businesses are and entrepreneurs are in our communities. Small businesses really boost the economy of their local economy, wherever they're placed. But not only that, but they do impact the entire Minnesota economy. So they're super important in our state.
That 45 to 50% number is incredible for us. It must mean that we have a very welcoming community for those type of businesses. But what kind of challenges do the small businesses and entrepreneurs face here?
I think the biggest challenges they have is really access to funding. So banking resources, and then also technical assistance, whether that's legal advice or just a business advice in general. You have to have the funds in order to get access to some of those professional services. And so I think that's a challenge for our small businesses, especially for the really small businesses that are under 5 employees.
Yeah, well, you mentioned technical assistance and advice, and you have a bill kind of targeting that. You have Senate File 1521, which asks to maintain the current funding for the state's Small Business Assistance Partnership Program. So talk to me about what that program does and what successes it has seen.
Yeah, so that program, we were trying to give it more funding this year above its $12.8 million base funding. But, you know, this year's a hard budget year, and so we weren't able to do that. But we're hoping that it will still be able to make an impact on our small businesses, especially those that need, again, the technical assistance. Those funding goes out to our nonprofits and our local governments to work with small businesses. So we're hoping that through that program, we will be able to reach those small businesses that need that help.
Yeah, help them succeed.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the smaller businesses, but do we have anything this session that aims at enticing bigger businesses to relocate here or retaining the ones we do have?
We love to keep our businesses that are here that are strong employers. But the number one thing we have to think about is skills and talent. And so that's really important. That means investing in people to make sure that they're able to develop the skills and develop new skills as jobs change. So that's really important, and that's what we've heard from our employers.
I love that phrase, investing in people. So the omnibus bill are out. We passed that third deadline. So what priorities or initiatives did the committee's resources focus on the most this session?
This session, we're focusing mainly on workforce development, on education, small business technical assistance, and really about economic growth. Senator Champion has been a huge advocate when it comes to making sure that we take care of all Minnesota businesses and entrepreneurs, and honestly, Minnesotans. We're giving them the opportunities to succeed and to start up a business or to make sure that their business thrives. And I really believe that this year's omnibus bill does that.
Well, speaking of the resources, budget targets came out and your committee received an increase in its funding over the next few fiscal years. So why do you think that was the case?
I think that the reason why we got an increase is because we know that we have to invest in our small businesses and in our economy if we want our economy to be strong. And if we stop investing, that also means that our economy is going to start seeing a decline, and we don't want that to happen. We know that at the federal level, there's all kinds of cuts, so that means that we can't have those cuts here. We have to make those investments.
That's right. They say you have to spend money to make money, right? Yeah. Switching slightly to Minnesota's workforce, we've been told that our workforce is aging out, and that's giving us some shortages across a variety of industries. So is there anything we can do at the state level to help with that?
We know that multiple professions are vulnerable to our aging population. So we have to make sure that we address that. One of the things that we have this year is called the Resilience Partnership, which helps people who are displaced due to whether it's age, skills, divorce, unplanned job loss, for them to get back into the workforce. So that's really important. The other bill that I am sponsoring is the Carts to Career bill, and that helps workers with training to meet specific licensure and skills to help them to advance in their career. So those are just two examples, but there's so much that we're doing this year to make sure that people are developing those skills and continuing to build on their skills so that they can remain in the workforce or that they can move across careers if that's what they choose to do.
Senator, you're also on the Housing and Homelessness Prevention Committee, and you've supported housing bills and reform packages. So talk to me about the intersection between these committees and how lifting one up might lift the other.
Workforce development helps people build on their skills, which means that they can get higher paying jobs, livable wage jobs. And when that happens, that also means that there's stability in housing. Higher pay, affordable housing, it really goes hand in hand, because now we don't have to worry about people not being able to afford the homes that they depend on for stability for their families. The other thing is that we invested $1 billion into housing in 2023, many of it targeting new development, new housing development, and affordable housing development. And so I think that really goes hand in hand, because when we invest $1 billion, that also means jobs. That also means construction jobs in every trade that comes along with that. And so it really is hand in hand.
Senator, I know that the jobs, or actually the housing and homelessness omnibus bill was just approved on the floor this week, so congratulations. Is there anything else you'd like to say on these topics?
In my district specifically, we're funding a program called Brooklyn, and it's one that's close to my heart. I actually, before coming to the Senate, I was a city council member and vice mayor in my city of Brooklyn Park for 6 years. And Brooklyn was really close to me because I worked with the youth there. That's a program that helps the youth develop opportunities that they can get internships, they can get work experience, they can get mentorship. It's so important for us to get our young people connected to those opportunities, because they're going to be our future workforce. And so that's a project that I love and that's close to me.
Oh, well, thank you for talking about that, Senator, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
We could become a model for other states.
Some social media companies profit from selling the consumer data they get for free. But here in Minnesota, that could change. DFL Senator Ann Rest has introduced Senate File 3197. If passed, the bill would make Minnesota the first state in the country to tax social media companies. The excise tax has different tiers based on the platform's number of users. Smaller social media platforms would pay nothing, whereas platforms with more than 1 million monthly Minnesotan users could face a base fee of $165,000 a month. The tax could generate $46 million in its first fiscal year and just under $100 million annually after that.
This bill is badly needed because it provides revenue that could be used to help those that will be hurt if the social safety net is shredded. If we don't commit to raising revenues to help those who will be hurt, our state will really be headed towards a crisis.
After the testimony, senators debated the bill's compliance with the Internet Tax Freedom Act and how that could have it challenged in court. Another concern was the impact the tax could have on the state's small businesses.
Our state is not in a position to bank, so to speak, balancing a $6 billion budget based upon a very risky proposal.
This is the big tobacco fight of our generation, and we can fight it and we can win it here in Minnesota.
We think here with this bill that we're only taxing those big social media companies. However, how do they pay for their services? It's through the advertising. And quite frankly, if you don't believe that the cost of their advertising is going to go up as a result of a new tax, I think you're kidding yourself.
This is simply modernizing our tax structure to reflect our current economy.
After a vote, the bill was laid over for possible inclusion in the Taxes Committee's omnibus bill. Improving the state's economy doesn't always call for large-scale initiatives. With me now is Republican Senator Rich Draheim, who says getting back to the basics can help grow Minnesota's economy for everyone. Senator, welcome to Senate Spotlight.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Senator, your bill, Senate File 227, garnered bipartisan support after it was heard. It aims to create a grant program for tax-stressed cities so that they can demolish blight structures. So talk me through the bill and what inspired you to write it.
Well, my district is very long and skinny, so I have 7 counties, and most of the communities in my 7-county area are smaller communities. So this bill was directed towards the lower tax-based communities that don't have a ton of resources to keep their community up. And in visiting with a couple of them, they had properties they wish they could afford to tear down, safety issue, and then potential redevelopment. And we have this program that is used for economic growth, and I thought this was a great fit for that program to just expand it a little bit. It was a match, so the community would have some skin in the game, and then the state would also help out. But it was meant just for kind of the poorest tax-based parts of our state.
And Senator, aside from being eyesores and unsafe, what kind of economic impact do blighted buildings have on their communities?
Well, you think about it. Do you want to invest in a building next to a half tore down building, or a building with broken windows, or maybe a fire hazard? And you know, a lot of these communities have all volunteer fire departments, which is a whole nother issue that we have, trying to recruit our first responders and our volunteer fire departments. So it's a safety issue also, you know, with the fire threat.
Yeah. Senator, during a committee hearing, it was mentioned that your bill, 227, can help cities reach their redevelopment goals. So what other major redevelopment trends or needs are you hearing about?
You know, the number one we hear, not just on the commercial side, but on the housing side, is the cost of infrastructure. So I've had many bills over the years with help with the infrastructure. So if you have a small community, especially like this bill was geared towards the lower tax-based communities, to put in a street infrastructure for just like one row of new housing. Most cities can't afford to do that. And when I started working on that bill, the cost for infrastructure for a block of houses was about $33,000 per lot. The cost to put in the water, sewer, et cetera, the road, gutter, sidewalk, lights, whatever. And now that's approaching $100,000 per lot. And so if we want to maintain our small communities, we have to make sure that they have daycare and housing and, a lot of the topics we hear about all over the state. But it's even harder in these smaller communities without a tax base.
Senator, proposing new initiatives that cost money is kind of a tough sell right now, considering where the state is economically and with our budget forecast. Were you concerned that that forecast would impact the progress of this bill or other initiatives like it?
Of course, timing's everything. And there are a lot of bills that I've worked on. I'll probably have 100 bills this year. And I write a lot of bills every year. And sometimes I'm just planning the idea for the appropriate time. Right now, it's back to basics. We should be focusing on the basic function of state government. I'm very concerned when I go back to my 7-county area and I hear from my county officials that they're looking at a 10 to 15% increase in property taxes across the board. So that is really hard, especially for that segment of the population on fixed incomes. And in our rural areas, most of our communities have a lot of seniors in them, and a lot of them are on fixed income.
Senator, talking about the budget, one idea that has been floated to help balance it is rooting out fraud and waste. And you have a bill, Senate File 240, which relates to nonprofits, that helps to aim with that. So talk me through that bill.
So we've seen an increase in use of state grants. Just cutting a check to mainly nonprofits, almost exclusively nonprofits. And, hit me one day when we had a nonprofit come in and ask for $500,000. And when looking on the 990 tax form that most nonprofits fill out, there's also another form that some other ones can fill out. But the executive was paid $500,000 a year. And it's hard for me to go back to my counties, and most of them are below average income counties, and say, hey, we want to give you your tax dollars so we can give it to a nonprofit that pays their executive a lot of money, at least for our area. And by the way, the nonprofit will only serve Minneapolis or St. Paul and not the whole state. So that is kind of part of why I did it. I remember when I was on the Health and Human Service Committee, we had a nonprofit healthcare provider that paid their top 16 executives $32 million. And that was probably 6 years ago. So, the whole definition of nonprofit, I think, needs to be looked at. And it's hard to give state tax dollars to a nonprofit that can afford to pay their executives that much money.
During the hearing for this bill, there was some pushback from certain nonprofits that said that it would hurt their ability to retain and recruit talent to run these organizations that help vulnerable populations. What is your response to that?
Well, when you look at the total compensation for the governor, and it's more than just his payroll, so he makes around $150,000, a little under that a year. But when you add in all the other benefits or compensation as defined, it'll be a little over $200,000. So you take 125% of that, I think that's quite a bit. And if it's truly a nonprofit meant to help serve the community, I don't think we need to be paying those executives that much. And when you look at the list of nonprofits and the executive pay, you will be astonished on some of them making millions of dollars for either financial institutions or medical institutions. And if they want to pay them that's fine. But just don't come and ask for state dollars, because I have a lot of nonprofits that pay their executives nothing, and it's totally volunteer. And I would rather fund something like that than an organization that can pay, let's say, $721,000 to a food shelf, their executive. And that nonprofit did great work. Nothing against that. But it is hard to swallow.
And when you mentioned the governor's compensation, you meant that it seems odd that they'd be making so much more than the governor?
Correct. We used to have a state law that you had to get a special exemption to make more than the governor. And now, you know, you look at the U of M, I think they had a few years ago 2,100 employees that make more than the governor. So, you know, at some point, you know, we have to evaluate what our priorities are. And then I go back into my district and we're cutting my nursing homes by $15 million. And, you know, our long-term care, we're shifting a whole bunch of expense onto our counties, et cetera. All the taxes will go up for our cities, our schools, are laying off teachers and paras, et cetera. So at some point we have to go back, what I call the basics, and reprioritize. And to me, we should have that pathway for education, and that should lead to a pathway for a career job, and then we should have a pathway to home ownership. Pretty basic.
Yeah. A report from the Office of the Legislative Auditor found that Minnesota's Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED, wasn't properly analyzing the impact of state-funded grants to nonprofits for their workforce programs. Do you think Minnesota needs greater reform in how it interacts with its nonprofits?
I've been a broken record on that for 9 years. You know, I think there's a couple different camps on that. There's the grant, like we currently do a lot of. There's one that's kind of pay for performance or fee for service. And then there's just general contracts. If we as a society decide we really need to offer these services that the nonprofits do, and there are a lot of good nonprofits out there, so I'm not attacking the nonprofit community, but there are also some bad ones. And, you know, we see people that come in that just set up an LLC to come in to set up a nonprofit to ask for money, and they have zero experience doing whatever they say they're going to do, and it's really hard to track what they're doing. And the other push I've had on that is that if we are going to spend money on these nonprofits that help train our next generation of workers, we should be doing it at the highest demand jobs and the highest paying jobs. So not to flip a burger, probably not to drive a forklift, because companies tell me all over the state that they will train their employees on how to do the basic stuff. But if we can get them into a career that they can provide for their family, why aren't we spending our time and resources on that? And that's what our goal should be.
Yeah, Senator, you mentioned there are a lot of good nonprofits out there, and there's one that you are known for supporting, which is the Rural Cancer Institute. You have a bill out, Senate File 3085, which aims to appropriate money for the nonprofit. So talk me through the need for that organization, why it has your support, and what your bill aims to do.
Well, we have a real nasty trend in outstate Minnesota. We have, a couple years ago, we were the worst state for pharmacy closings, meaning we had the most pharmacies closing of any state in the country in our rural areas. And we've had this consolidation trend in our healthcare clinics and hospitals across the state. And what happens, these bigger companies come in and swallow up a clinic or a hospital, and then they slowly limit the services. And you know, one service to me that makes the most sense to try to maintain is the oncologists or the cancer doctors, if you will. And you know, it's hard when you already have to drive 45 minutes to an hour to find a doctor, but then if you're closing half of them, and now you're going to go into 60 to 90 minutes to find a hospital that has an oncologist to get that care. And a lot of these treatments are multiple times a week. So that's one issue. And then the other issue is the hospitals that are left are having a hard time attracting doctors to work in the rural areas. So this is kind of twofold. Hopefully get the doctors into that environment so they can get exposed to it. Hopefully they fall in love with the idea of working in a rural setting versus a metro setting. And hopefully they could establish some roots in the community and be a productive member of the society in the local area.
Senator, you mentioned Greater Minnesota, and one of the testifiers in support of your bill said, Senate File 3085 would ensure rural Minnesotans aren't left behind based on where they live, which is something I've heard across many different committees on a variety of topics this session. Is that something you're hearing from your constituents? And if so, how do you respond to that?
Definitely. I mean, you look at the way of life in the rural areas, we're having a real hard time finding employees, and that housing and daycare were obviously two pieces to the puzzle. And when you look at housing, you need the right type of housing. And when you have an older population, they generally prefer like one-level living housing. We hardly have enough of that in rural Minnesota. But the staffing, the people to work the nursing homes, which are closing left and right across the state, especially in rural Minnesota. There's just so many segments. Our volunteer first responders, they have a very aging population of people willing to volunteer on there. We need bodies in rural Minnesota. And everything we do, it takes longer to drive. I remember we funded a grocery store in Minneapolis because it was too far for them to go to a grocery store. And I said, wait a minute, you don't know what too far is. I have communities that have to drive a half hour to get basic food. So I think there is a big disconnect between the lifestyle in outstate versus the metro area. And there's good people in both places. I think we just have to be mindful if we're going to spend resources on different projects, different training. I would rather spend a little money, and it isn't a very expensive bill on the oncologist, on someone that could save someone's life versus then training someone to flip a burger.
I would call saving someone's life one of those basic things we're looking for. Yeah, and you mentioned the volunteer first responders. I know you have a bill out to give them a tax credit to get more volunteers, and it got a lot of support in committee, so congratulations with that. Senator, any final thoughts?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to come in and discuss some of my bills, and hopefully we can get done on time and have a bill that helps cut away at that $6 billion deficit that's looming.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Senator.
Yep, thank you.
The Senate passed the Cannabis Omnibus Bill this week in a close vote of 34 to 32. If you'd like to watch the discussion and debate in full for yourself, head over to our YouTube channel at MN Senate Media. And if you subscribe to our channel, you can also receive notifications when committee meetings and floor sessions are happening live, so you won't miss a thing. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.